Welcome back, dear friends, to our peaceful corner of art history. Tonight, we explore a different kind of creative energy, the fire that burns when two great talents collide. We will journey through 10 of history's most fascinating artist rivalries, feuds that were sometimes bitter, sometimes productive, but always transformative. These were not simple disagreements. They were clashes of vision, ego, philosophy, and ambition. Some rivalries pushed both artists to greater heights. Others destroyed friendships and careers. A few turned violent, but all of them shaped the course of art history in profound ways. As we explore these conflicts, we will discover that competition can be creative fuel, that opposition can clarify vision, and that sometimes our greatest growth comes from struggling against those who challenge us most. So settle in, let the tensions of the day dissolve, and join me as we witness the drama, passion, and artistry born from rivalry. Let us begin this gentle exploration of creative conflict and its extraordinary fruits. 1. Michelangelo versus Leonardo da Vinci. Our journey begins in Renaissance Florence, where two of history's greatest artists found themselves locked in bitter competition. Michelangelo Buonarroti and Leonardo da Vinci, both geniuses, both revolutionary, both convinced of their own supremacy, could not stand each other. The feud began around 1504, when both artists were commissioned to paint battle scenes on opposite walls of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. This was a direct competition arranged by the city to showcase their two greatest talents. Leonardo, older by 23 years, was the established. Michelangelo was the young upstart, hungry to prove himself. Leonardo was elegant, refined, intellectual. He moved in courtly circles, dressed beautifully, and approached art as a science. He was gentle with his students and diplomatic with patrons. His interests ranged from anatomy to music. Michelangelo was rough, temperamental, obsessive. He dressed poorly, rarely bathed, and cared nothing for social graces. He worked alone, sleeping in his clothes, beside his marble blocks, attacking stone with furious energy. He cared only for art, and he cared about it with frightening intensity. The two men openly mocked each other. Once, Leonardo was discussing Dante with a group of Florentines when Michelangelo passed by. Someone suggested Leonardo ask Michelangelo to explain a passage. Before Leonardo could respond, Michelangelo snapped sarcastically, "Explain it yourself. You who made a design for a horse to be cast in bronze and could not cast it and abandoned it in shame." This was a cruel jab at Leonardo's greatest public failure, an enormous equestrian statue that was never completed. Leonardo went pale and walked away without a word, but the insult stuck and stung. Leonardo retaliated more subtly. He wrote in his notebooks criticisms of sculptors, clearly aimed at Michelangelo, saying they were covered in dust and sweat like bakers, while painters worked in refined elegance. He dismissed sculpture as mere mechanical labor, inferior to the intellectual art of painting. The commission for the Palazzo Vecchio should have produced two masterpieces. Leonardo worked on the Battle of Anghiari, developing an innovative technique to achieve particular effects. Michelangelo designed the Battle of Cassina, showcasing his supreme ability to render the human body in action. Neither painting was completed. Leonardo's experimental technique failed, causing the paint to run and blur. He abandoned the project. Michelangelo was called away to Rome by the Pope before he could begin painting, completing only preliminary drawings. The great competition ended in mutual frustration, with neither artist able to claim victory. Part of their mutual dislike was temperamental. They were opposite personalities, but deeper was a fundamental disagreement about art itself. Leonardo believed in grace, beauty, soft transitions, and intellectual planning. Michelangelo believed in power, force, terribilità, and awesome, fearsome energy. Leonardo thought sculpture crude. Michelangelo thought painting effeminate. Leonardo valued the mind. Michelangelo valued the hand and the will. They represented two different approaches to genius, and neither could accept the other's vision as valid. Their rivalry pushed both to innovate. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted shortly after the failed competition, shows him taking on painting with sculptural power, proving he could master Leonardo's art form while maintaining his own fierce style. It is arguably painted out of competitive fury. Leonardo continued developing his sfumato technique, his soft atmospheric effects, refining an approach completely opposite to Michelangelo's hard edges and dramatic contrasts. Each artist, in pushing against the other, clarified and strengthened his own vision. 2. Pablo Picasso versus Henri Matisse. We move forward to 20th century Paris, where two revolutionaries of modern art, Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, engaged in a rivalry that lasted decades. Unlike Michelangelo and Leonardo, these two actually became friends, but their friendship was built on competitive fire. They met in 1906, introduced by collectors Gertrude and Leo Stein. Picasso was 25, intense, ambitious, already making waves with his radical experiments. Matisse was 37, more established, leading the Fauvist movement with his wild, expressive colors. From the beginning, they were opposites. Matisse came from a middle-class background, trained properly at art school, and approached art with measured thoughtfulness. Picasso was working-class Spanish, self-trained through sheer will and talent, and approached art with ferocious energy. They visited each other's studios regularly, always taking careful note of what the other was working on. Each new painting was seen as a challenge, a statement to be answered. They were like chess players, each move by one artist requiring a counter move by the other. Matisse would experiment with bold color, and Picasso would respond by fragmenting form in his cubist works. Picasso would create something geometrically radical, and Matisse would answer with sensuous curves and patterns. They were pushing each other constantly, using each other as measuring sticks for greatness. Their collector friends encouraged the rivalry. The Steins would deliberately show each artist what they had just acquired from the other, knowing it would provoke a competitive response. The system worked. Both artists produced some of their greatest innovations during the years of their most intense rivalry. Despite the competition, they respected each other profoundly. Picasso kept a Matisse painting in his bedroom. Matisse kept Picasso drawings in his studio. When one bought a work by the other, it was the highest compliment, the recognition that an enemy had created something worth owning. Matisse once said, "We must talk to each other as much as we can. When one of us dies, there will be things the other will never be able to talk of with anyone else." It was an acknowledgement that they understood each other in ways no one else could, that their rivalry had created a unique bond. Not everything was friendly. Picasso could be cruel, mocking Matisse's work as decorative and superficial. He once said Matisse's art was like embroidery, meaning it was pretty rather than powerful. Matisse, more diplomatically, but no less firmly, suggested that Picasso's work was chaotic and lacked harmony. During World War II, with Paris occupied by Nazis, both artists remained in France. They occasionally crossed paths, their rivalry continuing even amid war and hardship. After the war, as both entered old age, the competitive edge softened slightly, but never disappeared entirely. When Matisse died in 1954, Picasso was devastated. He told friends, "He left me his odalisques," referring to Matisse's famous paintings of reclining women. Picasso then created a series of works in dialogue with the odalisques of Matisse, a final tribute to his greatest rival. This competition between Picasso and Matisse helped define modern art. Picasso's Cubism and Matisse's Fauvism were different responses to the same question: how to move beyond traditional representation. Their different answers opened up countless possibilities for 20th century art. Neither artist would have been quite the same without the other. They were the opposing poles between which modern art took shape. 3. Caravaggio versus Giovanni Baglione. Now we turn to a darker rivalry, one that turned violent and vicious. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, the revolutionary painter of dramatic light and shadow, found himself in bitter conflict with Giovanni Baglione, a more conventional but successful contemporary artist in Rome around 1600. Caravaggio arrived in Rome as a young man and quickly gained attention for his radical style, painting directly from life, using dramatic chiaroscuro, showing religious figures as real people rather than idealized saints. Giovanni Baglione was an established painter who worked in the more traditional manner. He was respectable, well-connected, successful in gaining church commissions. He represented everything Caravaggio was rebelling against. In 1602, Baglione painted Divine Love Conquering Earthly Love, a work clearly meant to compete with Caravaggio's style, while also criticizing it. The painting showed a triumphant angel trampling on symbols of earthly passion. Art historians believe the figure of earthly love, shown defeated and stripped of weapons, was a deliberate caricature of Caravaggio himself. Caravaggio was enraged. In the taverns and streets of Rome, he and his friends began spreading vicious poems about Baglione, mocking his art and his character. These poems were obscene, cruel, and very public. Baglione sued for libel. The trial became a sensation in Rome, with artists called to testify about the quality of both painters' work. Caravaggio and his friends were arrested. Caravaggio was briefly imprisoned, but eventually released, partly due to intervention by powerful patrons. But the damage to both men was done. Baglione was humiliated by the public mockery. Caravaggio had demonstrated his capacity for cruelty and his contempt for authority. This rivalry was about more than personal dislike. It represented a fundamental conflict between artistic approaches. Baglione's paintings were polished, idealized, proper, the kind of art the church officially preferred. Caravaggio's paintings were raw, realistic, troubling, art that showed saints with dirty feet and angels who looked like Roman street boys. Caravaggio's life was marked by violence. He killed a man in a brawl over a tennis game in 1606 and spent his remaining years fleeing justice. His rivalry with Baglione shows us the dark side of artistic passion, when ego and anger overwhelm judgment. After Caravaggio fled Rome as a fugitive, Baglione enjoyed vindication of sorts. He became a successful painter and later wrote one of the first histories of Baroque art, in which he took care to diminish Caravaggio's achievements. But history has rendered its own judgment. Caravaggio is remembered as one of art history's greatest revolutionaries. Baglione is remembered primarily for being the rival of Caravaggio. 4. Edgar Degas versus Edouard Manet. We turn now to 19th century Paris, where two giants of Impressionism, Edgar Degas and Edouard Manet, maintained a complex relationship that was equal parts friendship, rivalry, and mutual exasperation. Degas and Manet met in the Louvre in 1862, both copying old master paintings. They became immediate friends, recognizing in each other kindred spirits, both from wealthy families, both committed to painting modern life, both technically brilliant. They were close enough that Degas painted Monet with his wife, a gesture of intimacy and respect. Then came the incident that showed how volatile their relationship could be. Degas had painted Monet and his wife listening to music. He gave the painting to Monet as a gift. Some time later, Degas visited the studio of Monet and discovered that Monet had cut his wife out of the painting, literally slashed away that portion of the canvas. Degas was furious. It was his painting, his gift, and Monet had mutilated it. He immediately went to the house of Monet, retrieved all the paintings he had given Monet over the years, and took back a painting of plums that Monet had given him. They could not stay apart. Within months, they were back in the cafes together, arguing as before, but their relationship remained prickly. Degas was jealous of Monet. Monet was handsome, charming, elegant. Everything came to him naturally. Degas was more difficult, more acerbic, less socially graceful. Monet was frustrated by the constant criticism of Degas. Degas would stand in the studio of Monet, pointing out flaws and suggesting changes. Monet valued the judgment of his friend, but also found it exhausting. Despite painting similar subjects, their approaches were fundamentally different. Monet painted rapidly with bold, confident strokes, seeking spontaneity. Degas worked slowly, carefully, building up layers. He would say that the work of Monet was too casual. Monet would respond that the work of Degas was too labored. Each saw in the other's method a fundamental error in approach to art. Both artists produced masterpieces that define our understanding of 19th century Paris. In the end, their rivalry matters less than their achievements, which were made greater by their mutual challenge and critique. 5. Peter Paul Rubens versus Diego Velázquez. We move to the 17th century, to a more subtle kind of rivalry. Peter Paul Rubens, the great Flemish master, and Diego Velázquez, the court painter of Spain, were never open enemies. They met, they respected each other, but they represented fundamentally different approaches to art. In 1628, Rubens visited Spain on a diplomatic mission. He was 51, at the height of his fame and power. He stayed in Madrid for several months, and there he met the young Velázquez, who was 29 and just beginning to develop his mature style. They painted together, visited galleries together, and discussed art. Rubens was generous with advice, showing Velázquez Italian masterworks in the royal collection. It seemed like a simple mentorship, the established master guiding the younger artist. but beneath the courteous surface they represented opposing philosophies. Rubens' art was abundant, energetic, full of movement and flesh. His canvases burst with voluptuous nudes and swirling compositions. His art was about life overflowing its bounds. Velázquez's art was opposite, restrained, thoughtful, precise. He painted slowly, alone, thinking carefully about each brushstroke. His figures are still, his compositions balanced, his colors subtle. Where Rubens shows abundance, Velázquez shows dignity. After Rubens left Spain, Velázquez spent years refining an approach that was implicitly a rejection of the methods of Rubens. He would not paint with assistance. He would not create baroque exuberance. He would paint truth as he saw it, quiet, dignified, real. His masterpiece, Las Meninas, painted decades after meeting Rubens, represents everything the art of Rubens was not. Yet Velázquez learned from Rubens. His brushwork became looser after their meeting. Rubens showed him possibilities he had not seen before, even if Velázquez ultimately chose a different path. And Rubens may have learned something from the seriousness of Velázquez. Some of the later portraits of Rubens show a new restraint that might reflect the influence of the Spaniard. 6. Jackson Pollock versus Willem de Kooning. We leap forward to mid-20th century New York, where abstract expressionism was being born. At the center of this movement were two titans, Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, whose rivalry helped to define American art. In the 1940s and early 1950s, both artists lived and worked in Lower Manhattan, frequenting the same bars. Pollock was American-born, self-destructive, an alcoholic who swung between arrogance and insecurity. His drip paintings, made by pouring and flinging paint onto canvases, were revolutionary. De Kooning was Dutch, more intellectual, equally devoted to alcohol, but with better self-control. He maintained connections to figuration, particularly the female body, even in his most abstract work. He was a superb draftsman who chose to paint abstractly, while Pollock seemed to abandon drawing altogether. When Life magazine featured Pollock in 1949, asking, "Is he the greatest living painter in the United States?" it infuriated de Kooning. He believed his own work was more sophisticated and more technically accomplished. Pollock was getting attention for what de Kooning saw as mere spectacle. Pollock, for his part, was jealous of the critical respect of de Kooning. This drove Pollock to drink even more heavily. In bars, after too many drinks, their rivalry turned ugly. Pollock would attack de Kooning verbally, De Kooning would respond by suggesting Pollock was a one-trick pony. Once, Pollock urinated in a plant in the studio of de Kooning, a crude, aggressive gesture that showed how toxic their relationship had become. De Kooning never fully forgave the insult. Their rivalry was about fundamental questions. What should American art be? Should it completely break from European traditions, as Pollock did, or should it maintain connections to figuration, as the work of de Kooning did? Pollock died in a car crash in 1956, drunk, driving recklessly. He was 44. De Kooning lived on for decades. He never spoke ill of Pollock after the death of the artist, maintaining respect for his rival, even as he continued painting in his own different way. 7. Francisco Goya versus Anton Raphael Mungs. We travel to 18th century Spain, where a young Francisco Goya struggled against the established court painter Anton Raphael Mungs, a rivalry between an aging representative of academic perfection and a rising genius who would revolutionize art. Anton Raphael Mungs was the ideal court painter. He represented neoclassical perfection, smooth surfaces, ideal proportions, classical subjects. He was everything the Spanish court wanted. When the young Goya arrived at court in the 1770s, Mengs controlled access to royal commissions. He represented the gatekeeping power of established taste. Goya came from provincial Spain, from humble origins, but he had fierce ambition and extraordinary talent. He wanted the position Mungs held, principal painter to the king. Mungs blocked the advancement of Goya when he could, recognizing that this young provincial represented a threat. He suggested Goya lacked proper taste and refinement. The message was clear: you are an outsider and you will remain one. Goya responded by working harder, accepting any commission and building relationships with other patrons. He was determined to outlast Mungs. When Mungs died in 1779, the path for Goya cleared. Within a few years, he achieved the position he had been seeking, painter to the king. But his ascent coincided with illness that left him deaf, and this deafness seemed to liberate something in his art. The polite court portraits gave way to something stranger, the dark visions of the Caprico's etchings and the nightmarish Saturn devouring his son. Goya became the artist Mengs had feared he might be, someone who used his position to create art that challenged rather than comforted. The Goya-Mungs rivalry was a clash between generations. Goya was forced to master conventional techniques to compete with Mungs. But once he had that mastery, he used it to dismantle the very ideals Mungs represented. Goya is now one of history's giants, while Mungs is primarily remembered as the man who opposed him. 8. Frida Kahlo versus Diego Rivera. Some rivalries are external between separate artists, but the rivalry between Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera was internal as well. Each was at war with themselves about art, identity, and their tumultuous relationship with each other. When Frida Kahlo married Diego Rivera in 1929, she was 22 and he was 42. He was already one of the greatest artists of Mexico, creator of massive murals. She was unknown, just beginning to paint seriously, recovering from a bus accident. Everyone saw her as the wife of Diego, an appendage to his greatness. Diego was the public face of Mexican art, while Frida worked in the shadows on small, intimate canvases. But beneath the surface, a fierce artistic competition was brewing. Frida was not content to be an observer. She was building an internal world that would eventually rival the external world of Diego. Their marriage was a cycle of mutual inspiration and mutual destruction. Diego encouraged Frida to paint, but his constant infidelities and massive ego forced her to use her art as a shield and a weapon. She began to paint her own pain and her own complex identity with a ferocity that the murals of Diego could never match. While Diego was painting the masses, Frida was painting the individual. While he looked outward at society, she looked inward at the soul. In the end, the intimate explorations of Frida gained a global devotion that surpassed even the revolutionary fame of Diego. 9. Vincent van Gogh versus Paul Gauguin. In 1888, in the small town of Arles, France, two men lived together in a yellow house, attempting to create an artistic utopia. Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin were friends who became the most famous rivals in art history. A partnership that lasted only 9 weeks, but ended in blood and madness. Vincent was the emotional, impulsive dreamer who believed that art should be a direct expression of the soul. Gauguin was the arrogant, calculated professional who believed in memory and abstraction. They argued over every brushstroke. Vincent wanted to paint what he saw. Gauguin wanted to paint what he imagined. Vincent worked with thick, messy paint. Gauguin preferred smooth, flat surfaces. The tension in the yellow house became a pressure cooker. They drank heavily, argued until dawn, and competed for dominance over the same subjects. The rivalry reached its tragic peak in December of 1888. After a violent argument, Gauguin fled the house and Vincent, in a state of total mental collapse, famously cut off his own ear. Gauguin left Arles forever, and Vincent was hospitalized. Their short, explosive rivalry reminds us that sometimes two stars are too bright to occupy the same sky. 10. J.M.W. Turner versus John Constable. Our final rivalry takes us to 19th century England, to the halls of the Royal Academy, where two landscape painters fought a war of style and status. J.M.W. Turner and John Constable were the two greatest English painters of their time, but they could not have been more different. Constable was the painter of the English countryside, quiet, detailed, and devoted to the local beauty of his home. Turner was the painter of the sublime, of storms, steam, and light, pushing art toward a wild abstraction. Their rivalry came to a head at the Royal Academy exhibition of 1832. Their paintings were hung side by side. Constable had spent years on an elaborate, colourful scene of the opening of Waterloo Bridge. The painting of Turner, a grey seascape, looked plain beside it. In a legendary move, Turner walked up to his own painting during the final varnishing day and painted a single bright red buoy in the middle of the grey water. That one stroke of red made all the colours in the painting of Constable look dull and lifeless. Constable famously remarked that Turner had been there and fired a gun. Turner and Constable redefined what landscape could be, pushing each other to capture the light and the earth with a passion that had never been seen before. And so, dear friends, we reach the end of our journey through the fires of creative conflict. From the bitter battles of Michelangelo and Leonardo to the modern clashes of Pollock and de Kooning, we have seen that the history of art is not just a history of beauty, but a history of struggle. These rivalries remind us that we often need an opponent to find our own strength. They show us that competition, while sometimes painful, is the engine of innovation. It forces us to clarify our vision, to defend our choices, and to reach for heights we could never achieve alone. The friction between these great talents did not just produce paintings. It produced the very language of art as we know it today. As you prepare for sleep, let the energy of these feuds settle into a peaceful stillness. Think of the respect that lived beneath the rivalry of Matisse and Picasso, and the dedication of Gogh in the face of rejection. Remember that even in our own lives, the people who challenge us the most are often the ones who help us grow. May your dreams be filled with the transformative power of creativity. May you find inspiration in the struggle and peace in the achievement. Sleep well, dear friends, and know that even the fiercest fires eventually leave behind something beautiful and eternal. Good night.